Shedeur Sanders is testing the limits with the Cleveland Browns, and my defense of him is being tested as well. I'll explain on today's edition of Locked On NFL.
The new Locked On NFL. The madman Tyler Rowland is your double shot of NFL espresso, with the Locked On local experts on every major story. Get ready, Rowland is revving up. The new Locked On NFL starts now. Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Football fans, welcome into the Locked On NFL podcast, bringing you a double dose of the NFL's biggest stories with help from our local experts that know your favorite teams like no one else. I am your host, the Madman, Tyler Rowland, and once again, it is time for a Madman monologue edition of Locked On NFL. I'm riding solo today, and once again, we are going to be asking, what is the biggest question for teams around the NFL as we head towards training camp? We're going to talk about Cam Ward's coaching problem in Tennessee. We're going to talk about why Brian Daboll has it all to lose with the New York Giants, but we're going to start with Shedeur Sanders and the fact that he is just testing limits in Cleveland right now that he doesn't need to be testing, and it's time to lock in before we get to training camp. Before I dive into that, though, do want to thank you for making Locked On NFL your first listen and for being an everydayer here with us at the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when you win your first $5 bet. I'm looking at reports coming out of Cleveland, Shedeur Sanders, getting speeding tickets, going 100 miles per hour. And, I see reports that there might have been two. I don't really care about the number at this point. It's just the activity in general. I have defended Shedeur Sanders throughout this entire process. I thought that he was a guy that should go late first round. I thought the Pittsburgh Steelers would make sense. If not, someone maybe trade back into the late first round, second round. To see him drop all the way to the fifth round, quite frankly, as I've said throughout this process, absolutely ridiculous. He may not have been a first round talent. Okay, that's fair. We can all accept that. But he's not a fifth round talent either, and he's certainly better than Dillon Gabriel, or had better tape than Dillon Gabriel coming out, with better traits than Dillon Gabriel coming out. And the question became, or not the question, the answer seemed to be, it's the personality stuff. It's the Deion Sanders connection, which I personally have said all along is actually just these guys in the NFL, these coaches, these general managers, they don't want to get fired and replaced by Deion Sanders. If Shedeur comes in and he looks pretty good, but you don't win games, the roster's bad, what are they going to do? They're going to say, why don't I just fire these guys who aren't getting the job done in Cleveland? Kevin Stefanski, Andrew Berry, who may be in hot water already because of the Deshaun Watson situation. That's why they passed on him. And then they went and they drafted Dillon Gabriel so that they could go to the owner and say, we can't take another quarterback. And the owner said, you're going to trade up and do that right now, which in a crazy turn of events, to me, I agree with the owner. I agree with the owner meddling there, because what are we doing? But think about all the other spots that were a possibility. The Giants, we're going to talk about them in a minute. Their power structure is on shaky ground with ownership already. The Saints, you get Ross Jackson from Locked On Saints, who co-hosts this show with me on Fridays, the mastermind. He came on here at one point in time and said he didn't know if a strong personality like an Aaron Rodgers would be good for Kellen Moore as a head coach. And to me, when I hear that, I'm like, okay, so Kellen Moore can't handle, something like that. So Shedeur Sanders comes in. Maybe that's too much for Kellen Moore to handle. He looks terrible in year one. Deion Sanders wants to come down to New Orleans. I could just see how it could be a fearful situation more than surface level. So I've defended Shedeur. I think that he should start in Cleveland. I think he's going to be the best quarterback by the end of the year for them. Maybe he's not as good as Joe Flacco right away, because Flacco's such a vet. But, eventually, what are we doing with Joe Flacco in Cleveland? Like, why, unless Cleveland somehow turns back the clock to a couple of years ago and they're an 11-5 football team, which I think the roster is significantly worse, then why would we not play Shedeur Sanders? And if you keep losing, you lose with a purpose and you gain knowledge about your future. And if you win, And if you win, then you look like geniuses because you drafted Shedeur in the 5th round, and now he's your starting quarterback that you can build around going forward. I don't think he's ever going to be a top 10 quarterback or whatever. I think he can be a solid like Derek Carr level, Jared Goff, Kirk Cousins. I think he can be that level of quarterback, and if you build a good enough team and roster, then you have a chance, at least. Excuse me. Now comes the frustration. Because the one thing that you can't do when you're Shedeur Sanders, the one thing that you cannot do, that you can't let happen, is off-field distractions. Because then what you do when you do that is you prove everybody right who was wrong about you. One thing that I said throughout the process that I didn't like is, yes, he garners a lot of attention. Yes, his father garners a lot of attention. Okay, hopefully your quarterback becomes the type of person who garners a lot of attention. Like, are the Bengals angry that Joe Burrow garners a lot of attention? Or are the Eagles angry that Jalen Hurts gets a lot of attention? Are the Bills mad Josh Allen is on every commercial around TV and marrying a movie star? Are the Bills mad? No! They're popping champagne. We got the golden goose. So I don't think that Shedeur will necessarily be that level of talent, but he can garner that level of attention. The problem with that is on the other side of that sword is if you don't do the right things off the field, that can ruin everything. Because I defended Shedeur over and over and over because I'm like, hey, yeah, his dad and him, they get attention, but he's not like some guy who's causing problems off the field. He's not like a bad person who's going to embarrass your organization. He just might flash a watch or, make a rap song or something, which all kinds of professional athletes are doing more often now. It's barely even a thing anymore. But I can't defend him and say that he needs to be the starter and they got to steal and he dropped too far. If he starts to prove people who assign that sort of behavior to him prematurely when he didn't deserve it, well, if he starts to fulfill that prophecy by making mistakes off the field, then I can't defend him anymore. Now, I'm going to throw it to my guy Spencer from Locked On Browns, who talks about how a speeding ticket, who most of us, I'm not condoning it, as Spencer talks about, but most of us listening to this, if you're an adult, you have a driver's license, at some point in time, you've picked up a speeding ticket, you didn't realize how fast you're going downhill, you just were in a hurry, something like that. Not condoning speeding, but at the same time, let's hold off on making bold proclamations.
Shedeur Sanders getting a speeding ticket is basically like a non-issue. It's nothing that we need to make into a bigger thing. And I know people are going to do that. People will find ways to use this mistake, this one situation, as reason why Shedeur Sanders isn't ready for the NFL or isn't ready to be a starting quarterback for the Cleveland Browns. The fact of the matter is, like, guys make mistakes, and speeding is like one of the least egregious of that you can make. I've gotten speeding tickets before. I'm sure you listening have gotten a speeding ticket, and if you haven't, I tip my cap to you, sir, for not being ever caught speeding or speeding at all, or whatever you want to call it. It's something that's pretty common. Now, is it common to go 101 in a 60-mile-per-hour zone? Probably not. But at the same time, like, it's a young kid making a mistake here, and it doesn't have to be anything more than that. It doesn't have to be anything more than a learning experience for him as he realizes, like, the spotlight that he has on him as an NFL player, and that he is going to be held to sort of this higher standard, which I think he already understands. I mean, again, we've talked so much about Shedeur and how polarizing of a player that he is, and the fact that he, has grown up in the spotlight because of his dad, and he understands the magnitude that comes with that. I think he just simply made a mistake here, and it doesn't have to be anything more than that. But I know there are going to be people who try to equate this to him as a player, him and his play on the field, and the things that come with that, and that he's not, like I said, not ready for that, or that he isn't going to be a good decision maker because of these things. It's a silly, silly thing to do. Like, that cannot be part of the equation here when it comes to Shedeur Sanders making a mistake here. It's whatever. This doesn't have to be an indictment on his character or on him. It wasn't a smart thing to do, but it doesn't impact in any way, shape, or form his ability or should it impact his ability to compete for the starting quarterback job when training camp opens up in late July.
Very well said by Spencer there from Locked On Browns. I think at the end of the day, you're not saying it's okay to speed, but you're also saying on the other hand, I don't think it means that all of these haters were right about Shedeur Sanders, and now he can never be anything, and his story is told now, and oh, there it is, just like we thought, but in this grandstanding and victory lapping that doesn't make any sense. It's just saying, no pun intended, pump the brakes on that, okay? And I think clearly for the Browns, the biggest question is, what is the future at quarterback? And I guess, in my opinion, the answer is still, let's take a look at Shedeur Sanders. He's your best path forward, no matter what happens. But with that in mind, similar question for the Giants, but there's more of an immediate pressing matter, and particularly in the front office. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Look, summer sports are in full swing now, whether you're all about baseball under the bright lights, golf on the greens, or high-stakes soccer action. FanDuel is the best way to make every game even more exciting. Look, you're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburnt at the beach. I love using FanDuel to track my favorite matchups. The app is constantly refreshing with new daily promotions that have super fun ways to bet and get great value. Same game parlays are just absolutely fantastic. You can, bet on a couple of different things to happen so that you can get more value out of your wagers. It's absolutely fantastic, and that's why FanDuel makes you feel like you're part of the action. If you're new to FanDuel, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Football fans, let's continue today's edition of Locked On NFL. Again, it's another Madman Monologue edition, flying solo on this one. It's a summer break for the NFL, but there is no break here on the Locked On NFL podcast, Monday through Friday, all year round. Heck, you get 2 shows a day from Locked On NFL, so you can't beat that. Make sure you get subscribed, stay subscribed. It's your team every day here at the Locked On Podcast Network. But we're doing our biggest question series as we look at every single NFL team heading towards training camp. We talked about Shedeur Sanders and the Cleveland Browns and focused on that speeding ticket issue, non-issue, but something to watch moving forward. He definitely needs to lock in instead of clock in. Sorry, I had to throw a terrible joke in there somewhere. But speaking of a terrible joke, the New York Giants have had a rough stretch for quite some time now. A little bit of a playoff appearance and win with Daniel Jones a couple of years ago, but that seems like a long, long time ago. But this year, there's optimism in New York. They bring in different quarterbacks, and they've made some additions around the roster, and now there's starting to be the dangerous E word, expectations for the New York Giants. And I'm going to throw it to the Locked On Giants podcast to hear about why the roster is so much better now.
The roster overall is most improved within the frontline starters. Obviously, quarterback is where they are most improved significantly, 1, 2, and 3. And then on defense, the front 7 is where they vastly improved with the advent of Abdul Carter and, what they can potentially do with him and along with Dexter Lawrence, Thibodeau, and Burns. So because you've improved the quarterback position so much, it now introduces everyone to what the receiving core could potentially look like, or what it is actually like, as opposed to what we thought it was going to be based upon what we saw with these quarterbacks that they used to have on the roster. But now you have a chance to see the full-fledged talent on display of the receiving core. And on defense, once they get pads on, because this is kind of like easier for them to simulate pressure because of, they can't really be blocked because there's no pads on. So they always have the advantage. But you just love the speed and explosiveness off the ball with what we're seeing from that front 7.
I mean, the hype is building The hype is building for the Giants, and I understand why. I've had so many conversations before the draft, leading up to the draft, talking about where would be the best spot for a good quarterback, what team makes the most sense. And I know that the Giants have been in a bad spot, and just the vibes around the New York Giants are not great. Nobody looks at the New York Giants and thinks of them as this great organization right now, like we should, like an organization that has 4 championships and has won throughout decades and had, Eli Manning's run where they won multiple Super Bowls in a handful of years. It's an organization that should be looked at a little bit better than it is. And I know it's fun to hate on the big market teams, all the small markets all across the country hate the big markets and everything like that. But I look at the Giants roster and I'm like, okay, I do see a path. And that's why I said it was a good landing spot for a guy like an Aaron Rodgers if they wanted to go to the veteran route, because I think Aaron Rodgers is better than Russell Wilson. If the Giants wanted to make a trade up and maybe secure Cam Ward in the draft if they were willing to pay the price, I thought it would make sense for them. And you have Malik Neighbors, who is a true number 1 wide receiver, in my opinion, and improved it already. He's got to stay healthy, and they got to maybe take a little bit of weight off him. Would be nice, make him more efficient, maybe with little less volume. And I know the fantasy players out there are like, what do you mean less volume? But a little less volume, a little more efficiency, and then keep him healthy. He is a young player. You want him to have a long career there and be your number 1 dominant wide receiver for a while. And I think he's got true ability to do that. Wan'Dale Robinson is a good slot. Darius Slayton is a solid starting wide receiver. I wouldn't say it's, in the clip talking about now we can see what these wide receivers can do. Obviously I like Neighbors. I like Robinson. Slayton is a good player. Jalen Hyatt has never really worked out of Tennessee. So I don't think their wide receiver group is like incredible or something like that. And it's like just this hidden gem. I think Malik Neighbors is absolutely incredible and will be a top 10 wide receiver this year. But even with that, top 10 wide receiver, solid slot, and Wan'Dale Robinson, Darius Slayton, although he's, he doesn't vault them up into incredible status, he is a solid starting wide receiver. So that's a pretty good threesome to work with there. And Jalen Hyatt is a former 3rd-round pick. So you got to think, that's a decent number 4. And then Andrew Thomas is excellent at left tackle. If he can just be healthy, stay healthy. John Runyon at left guard coming over from Green Bay. I like that. John Michael Schmitz needs to take steps forward, but I liked him coming out of the draft in the 2nd round in 2023. The right side of that offensive line will be something that you watch. Greg Van Roten at guard. Evan Neal, is he going to actually secure that spot after being a bust at offensive tackle after being drafted in the 1st round in 2022? They draft Marcus Mbow out of Purdue in the 5th round. Can he step up? That's a big question mark right there that maybe could catapult the opposite of that. It could destroy their offensive dreams. But obviously you look at the quarterbacks, and I am not as high on Russell Wilson as some others seem to be. A lot of my co-hosts here on the Locked On NFL podcast think that Russell Wilson is a better player than Aaron Rodgers right now. I don't know that I agree with that. Jameis Winston, you know what he's going to give you. He giveth and he taketh. I don't think Jameis Winston gets the Giants to anywhere that's absolutely incredible. And then, of course, you have Jaxson Dart, who they traded up for in the 1st round. But the thing is, you look at all of that on offense. You have a number 1 wide receiver. You have 3 decent pieces on the offensive line, and you have depth with pedigree. You have a veteran quarterback with a championship. You have a good backup in Jameis Winston. You got yourself a 1st-round quarterback as well. Cam Scatteraboo, Devin Singletary, Tyrone Tracy. That's a pretty good average group of running backs. It's not a disastrous one. And then look at the defense. That's where I do agree completely with the clip here. I mean, Dexter Lawrence and Roy Robertson Harris inside, Brian Burns, Kayvon Thibodeau, and of course you add Abdul Carter into that mix in the 1st round. That's pretty impressive. I like Tyler Nubin at safety. They signed Javon Holland, who's a guy that I'm a big fan of. They have, quite a bit of talent. And Brian Daboll's won a playoff game with Daniel Jones, and you're telling me that Daniel Jones is so absolutely awful that we cut him after 2 years in this big contract? And it's like, okay, maybe it's not fair, but at some point, everything that we just said The big question is clearly, can Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen, the general manager, save their jobs here? What does it look like? Because you can't argue. I don't think that there's any path for the Giants to have like a 5-win season at this point. I think you're getting fired. Because you're going to go with Russell Wilson. And you have told your ownership that you're protected from Russell Wilson falling apart with Jameis Winston. We have two very experienced veterans, one Super Bowl champion, another very experienced guy who's one of the best backups in the league. We're going to win games. We got a good enough roster. Look at all this talent. Joe Schoen, the GM, look at all this talent I've amassed. Okay. All right. Awesome. Well, what are you going to do? Oh, well, the veterans didn't work out. Oh, no. Well, you let us trade future draft capital and move up and get the quarterback that we truly loved in the first round. This was our guy all along. Well, you sat him for half a season or 10 games because you were playing the veterans that you said could lead you to victories because the roster's good enough. And now he looks bad. Like there's not an easy path here unless Brian Daboll is able to thread the needle in a perfect way where the team looks good, it all looks bad at the quarterback. But then the questions become, why can't you get another quarterback? If Daniel Jones was so bad, why can't you get any other quarterback to play as good as you made him play? And then the owner's looking at you sideways. So the point is, the biggest question by far for the Giants is, will Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen survive the season, or will we see an entirely new regime come in? And then if they do that, what if that regime wasn't high on Jaxson Dart coming out of the draft and didn't want Jaxson Dart? Now it's just such a tough spot for them to be. If things don't go right for the Giants, it could set them back, 3 years. Because they got to roll with Jaxson Dart, who they don't like, and then is it a Will Levis situation? And now, it could get, and you missed the 2016 draft. Maybe you missed the 2017 draft where there's supposed to be some pretty decent quarterbacks that pop up. It could be disastrous for the New York Giants. So that's the biggest question. And honestly, I don't have a good answer. If I had to, guess, I would tell you that I don't think the Giants make the playoffs. I don't think that they win enough games to satisfy ownership. But we got to see how it all plays out because I do think that they have talent on the roster. So it is a question of how good is Brian Daboll? How good? Joe Schoen has put together some good pieces, just his big misses. The Saquon Barkley thing on Hard Knocks. It is hard to come back from something like that long term. But, I think they have some talent. It's a tough division, though. We'll see how it all plays out. But the Tennessee Titans also drafted a quarterback in the first round. And obviously, I'll do a little bit of home cooking for you guys. All right, let's cap off today's edition of Locked On NFL. We have talked about Shedeur Sanders and the Cleveland Browns' biggest question. We've talked about the New York Giants and the head coaching situation, their biggest question going forward. Now, I want to get into the Tennessee Titans. And yes, I do cover the Tennessee Titans. That is my primary team here with the Locked On Podcast Network. A little bit of home cooking. Been paying quite a bit of attention to this team for quite a bit of time. So no better person, I guess, to give you their biggest question. And I'll be honest about a kind of a quiet issue nobody wants to talk about in Tennessee or outside Tennessee. It's not something that's getting a lot of attention. And I think with Cam Ward, it is a big storyline. Before I dive into it, though, I do want to thank you for making Locked On NFL your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On NFL Scouting. As training camp gets closer, moves are being made, and host Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino will make you the most informed NFL fan this offseason. Find Locked On NFL Scouting on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. But with the Tennessee Titans, they get Cam Ward, and that's great, but why did they get Cam Ward? They went 3-14 last year, and something that if you're not watching a ton of Tennessee Titans football on a week-to-week basis, which I would imagine most of you listening are not, except my Titans fans out there, which I hope any Titans fan listening to this check out Locked On Titans as well, but it wasn't just that the Titans had a bad roster and Will Levis and Mason Rudolph were terrible at quarterback. Brian Callahan lost them some games. They were unprepared. They had bad game plans. He played some hurt players like Will Levis in Week 6 against the Colts that didn't make any sense. So Brian Callahan is to blame in a major way for his inability to adapt to Will Levis's strength, his game planning, the special teams coaching that he allowed to happen. I could go into details, but this isn't Locked On Titans. The point is, Brian Callahan is a guy who, if you don't know because you don't pay attention to the Titans significantly, Brian Callahan is a guy that should be on the hot seat, and I think is on the hot seat this year. If the Titans come out and have another terrible season, I don't know if Brian Callahan survives. Remember, Brian Callahan was hired by Ran Carthon, who was fired. And remember that Mike Vrabel did not want Ran Carthon to be hired as the general manager. And then they fired Mike Vrabel because they wanted to keep Ran Carthon. And then a year later, Ran Carthon hires Brian Callahan. And then Ran Carthon is fired at the end of the season. And now the Titans have a new general manager who's Mike Borgonzi from the Kansas City Chiefs. And will he want to keep Brian Callahan around when he wasn't really the guy who hired Brian Callahan? It's a back and forth. That's, why the Titans got the number 1 overall pick probably at the end of the day. But the point is Brian Callahan is firmly on the hot seat. And right now, whether you're outside of the Titans circle or you're a fan or whatever, right now it is fair to question whether the Titans have good enough coaching going forward. And my guys over on Locked On NFL Scouting, Joe Marino and Kyle Krabs, who I was just talking about, they actually brought up the fact that, Cam Ward with these coaches may not be the best fit.
All right, coaching for Cam Ward, head coach Brian Callahan. Young quarterbacks that he's been a part of the drafting and early development. Joe Burrow in Cincinnati, people know about that. How about Tim Tebow back in Denver? He was there his first year in the NFL. They drafted Tim Tebow with their first-round pick, and then a few years later, Brock Osweiler. Nick Foles, your offensive coordinator, second year as an NFL OC, was the Jags passing game coordinator in 23. UNLV's OC in 2022, and then an 8-year stretch as an offensive assistant with the Raiders from 2012 to 2020. Quarterback's coach here is Bo Hardegree. He is an Adam Gase, Josh McDaniels understudy. That's pretty much been his career, coaching as an assistant under both of those guys. A good stretch with Gase, followed him a couple of places, and the same thing with McDaniels. And then the X factor here for this coaching staff is senior offensive assistant Mike McCoy, former head coach in the league. I mean, he's been an important offensive coach in the NFL since 2000. What I noticed about all 4 of these names, they are all West Coast heavy background guys.
Yeah.
And you could tell they probably all speak the same language. They want to run it a certain way. And I think that's fine. It's interesting to insert Cam Ward into this, where I don't know that you go looking at Cam Ward and say, you know what? Timing, route depth, precision. I hope that they learn some lessons with Will Levis last year, and that you can't fit that quarterback into your bucket, right? You need to be able to allow that quarterback to do the things that make them dynamic physically, and that's what you have in Cam Ward. So I think this is a pretty decent group. I gave it a 2.5. I think it's slightly below average. I don't think it's prohibitive, but I'm curious to see how they incorporate Cam Ward and all of the things that he does versus, I think, the style of offense they all prefer to run.
Now, Joe does some excellent work, and you guys have to check out Locked On NFL Scouting. But I guess when I watch Cam Ward's tape in college, I've done quite a bit of film work on Cam Ward. I guess I don't see timing, precision, route depth. I don't think that Cam Ward's incapable of that. He gets the ball out of his hands pretty quickly when he's not extending plays. And I think that you have the ability to play on rhythm, timing, precision, all of that. And still, when that is not available, then you can use those athletic gifts and move around and do that stuff that Cam Ward did in college. So I think it's fair to wonder how it'll work with that coaching staff, but I don't know if it's that Cam Ward isn't a fit for what they want to do and his skill set doesn't fit into that box. I don't know if that's the concern with the coaches. My concern with the coaches is that they're just not good enough. Look, Brian Callahan didn't call plays for the Cincinnati Bengals, so now he's basically a first-time offensive coordinator calling the plays for the Titans and a first-time head coach. He's a younger guy. People are questioning Zach Taylor right now in Cincinnati with their struggles in recent years. Is Brian Callahan a good coach? The jury is still out. Right now, if you had to lean, you would lean towards Brian Callahan being a bad coach. Most of the head coach rankings that come out around this time of year have Brian Callahan last, if not last, in the very, very bottom. So if he's just not a very good head coach, maybe I think Brian Callahan will be a very good offensive coordinator if he gets let go as the Tennessee Titans head coach in the next year or two. I think he'll go take a job as an offensive coordinator where he does call plays and he just installs his offense and teaches the players and all that. And I think he's going to be excellent about that. But does he have the rah-rah leadership capabilities necessary to be a big-time head coach? That remains to be seen. That's something that has to be answered this year. And maybe Joe is correct, and Cam Ward's skill set is not a great fit for what Callahan wants to do. And like last year where he tried to jam Will Levis, who was not good in that West Coast quick timing passing system, if Cam Ward struggles in that early on and Callahan doesn't pivot in time and things go off the rails and Cam Ward looks bad, then that would crush his ability to keep his job. So I know that any non-Titans fan that hears about the Titans would say, Cam Ward, is he good? That's the biggest question. But to me, the biggest question actually, from a zoomed-in view, is Brian Callahan the right coach for the Tennessee Titans? And will they look even more foolish with their decision to let go Mike Vrabel if they have to let go of Brian Callahan within 2 years, and they went with Brian Callahan and Rand Carthon and got rid of Mike Vrabel, and then within 2 seasons after, both of those guys are gone and you have brand new guys? That would look like a colossal mistake. So that's the biggest question for the Titans going forward. And again, we're going to get our answer this season because I don't think you can get your answer right now. But with that being said, that is going to do it for today's Madman Monologue edition of the show. Make sure that you tune back in tomorrow. We're going to continue our series on biggest questions. If there's big news that breaks, of course, I'll be here to break that down. But that's going to do it for me today. As I tell you guys every single episode, thanks for tuning in and stay safe out there.